Yeah. Um, so, sure, yeah. My name is Adam Saltsman. I am a game game developer person, I suppose, and also dad. And my wife Rebecca and I sort of run a little game studio together, and we publish some indie games, and we make our own indie games sometimes. We've been doing it for like 10 or 15 years now, and we currently reside in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with our kids and our puppies, and I suppose possibly relevant to everything that we're talking about. I think we're coming up, I think, on like the 1-year anniversary of me refusing to use Twitter anymore, except for the very rare occasional promotional tweet.
Oh, you know what's weird is that I had no idea because I either have exceeded that or but I didn't do what you're supposed to do, which is no judgment if you did, which is I didn't slam the door when I left. I just stopped logging in one day. But I hear that that's increasingly a thing that people are doing. I mean, I like what that's probably the best lead in, because what's not going to be clear for people, reading/listening to this is that we just started emailing like a few months ago, but we weren't talking about the fact that we both have this in common. So, what led you to sort of, maybe this is an obvious answer, but what led you to sort of peace out on Twitter?
There was a bunch of different things. I think, the chief thing is it's sort of like level of usefulness for me seemed to be dropping a lot. I think that's, professional, also like personal to some degree. I think Twitter was professionally valuable for me for quite a long time, and it didn't seem to have a whole lot of downsides. And some of that's related to how the site actually functioned and what it sort of optimized for and things like that. And then, even when it stopped being maybe obviously professionally useful, I felt like it was still kind of personally useful, because it was sort of a way to listen to people that you might not have the opportunity to listen to in your normal day-to-day life in a small Michigan city or whatever.
Right.
And I felt like there was a lot of value in that. I think we got, new partnerships and new friendships and things out of Twitter for a long time. And it seemed like the amount of time I was spending on Twitter was going up, and the amount of sort of useful, interesting things that were actually coming out of it were going down.
I mean,
so it turned out kind of like log in, like see if there's some really good drill tweets, and then just get really sad and log out again.
I should say, even though I have left Twitter behind, I do have on my phone, and I had even gotten to the point where like I had scaled back using social media, where it's like I'm just going to use it on my computer. I don't want to use it when I'm out, not sitting down. But like on my browser, on my phone, I have like 3-4 tabs open to Twitter, and one of them is still drill.
It's good content.
So, some things transcend these feelings, although I do wonder but I wonder if that's like a known bell curve for, I'm not going to ask you to speak for all the game developers, but I've really spent the last few years talking to a great deal of them, and they hate Twitter. They feel they can't talk about that publicly. I've often heard it said, like, the point of Twitter is to no longer need Twitter.
A little bit, right?
So what's that about? I mean, is that just a thing that everybody goes through, or everybody should go through, or do you think this was just a very individual journey for you?
I mean, I think the thing about Twitter. So here's how I actually left Twitter. Is Becca was my sort of partner in life and business. Becca was traveling overseas about a year ago, and for me that was the big challenge because like my hobby was like if Becca was traveling, I would get the kids in bed, and then I would get a little bit drunk and shitpost until I fell asleep, basically.
Okay.
Which is a pretty good hobby, I think. Like I'm not saying like this was a dark time in my life where all I would do was like have a beer and type dumb stuff on Twitter. Like that was fun to do. It was all right. But for me, that was like the test was like. I feel like Twitter on the whole is kind of has turned into a pretty substantial net loss for me. Here's how we'll test if I can make it is I'm just going to not log in the whole time that Becca's traveling because it's a social thing, right? Like it's like the extremely literal social part of social media is I'm bored and I don't play Destiny. So like Twitter is the next best thing down the list, kind of.
Right.
Was how it functioned for me anyway at that point, right? It was kind of past the point of, oh, this is a great professional networking tool, or, I choose to view the time I spend on this site as quote unquote signal boosting the work of other artists or whatever,
right.
which, ostensibly does have some value and it's something that I sort of wanted to try to do with the site also. And yeah, just like it felt like it wasn't adding up, and it felt like, oh, there are enough other things you can do online. There's like normal text messaging, and there's Discord now, and there's all this other stuff, and maybe you don't actually need to do Twitter specifically to like scratch that social online itch.
You can also get work done.
Yeah. Yeah, you can do some stuff.
If
like
you're feeling old-fashioned, you could just do that. You can just focus on what you're doing and do it. But I don't want us to sound like, it's hard because I've found through the years you talk publicly about this stuff and people feel they're being judged or like you're insulting the fact that they're still on it. And I was trying to figure out like, well, what is this swirl of stuff that like when we started emailing back in September or whatever, like what is this wavelength we're both locking on? And I feel like the umbrella of it is that like why I think the bigger question that I could figure out is like why are people shocked that the like why was there this assumption that the internet was going to be immune to societal forces? Like why did we expect it to be a utopia, even among people who don't really believe in utopias? And like, why did they think, Twitter, for example, would be some sort of great holdout? Because I figure like what we're talking about, it's not really video games, even though I think video games get like, they sort of become the black sheep and easy to blame for these kind of problems. It's not just the internet. It's not just social platforms. I think it's, I don't know, like when we were emailing about whatever we were emailing about, like what is the category header of all this stuff? Like, why is it like, we haven't talked in a couple of years. Why is it we can just check in and we're like, yeah, we're both feeling this thing.
Yeah. So like, there's two big things sort of around this for me. And one of them was like, I needed to personally go through a bunch of steps to, boy, this is starting to sound a lot like post-addiction sort of therapy counseling stuff suddenly. But I had to go through like a lot of steps to try to sort out, what is my relationship to this sort of like website /service /group of kind of online friends, which has always been a thing for me. Like, this is a digression within a digression now. Sorry. But like, a lot of my art career came out of an old like pixel art website called Pixelation, or Way of the Pixel, and there was this amazing community of people on there who would give you really actionable feedback and help you grow as an artist. And I started to get work out of that, and then was really active on the TigSource forums for indie games back in the day, and like made a lot of my best friends and like most important collaborators came out of being involved in that website. And Twitter seemed like a really reasonable next step. Like, I was definitely not on Twitter to follow the world news or anything like that. It was like, the people that I think are creatively interesting and who I would love to be connected with online for a variety of reasons seem to be going this way. And so cool. I've been sort of spending a few years on each of these lovely sites, and this seems like a nice place to go to next or whatever. And that part of it is still valuable to loads and loads of people. I think that's like the real valid use of the real valid personal use of social media is still to fill this kind of void for a lot of people, which is, I think, a lot of people benefit from and appreciate having a wider creative network than they have access to locally.
Yeah.
At least in my zone of things. I think there's lots of other reasons to use social media, but like a big positive force there is, the people that you admire or who you want to follow or who you want to sort of quote unquote hang out with, whatever that means online, they might not work in your building or live in your city. And so like there's always been a function of the internet, which has been to address this in some way. And that's always been marvelous. So the two big things for me are like, okay, so that's a big positive, but there's all these like really obviously mechanically bad things going on, many of which are new-ish. There are discrete, specific, like documented platform changes, especially from like 2014 up through 2016, not just in the way the platforms are represented in broader culture, but the actual way that they function and the way that they talk about themselves. Like 2014, like Arab Spring is when you start to see social networks referring to themselves in the third person as important parts of how the world works.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not what they were used for. Like I spent 5 years or something on Twitter before there was a notion that the service itself could refer to itself that way, and that it was not a self-fulfilling prophecy exactly, but sort of like a reflection of wider, more conventional media starting to treat the way the platform functioned in this like legitimizing way.
I think so. Yeah, I'm glad, because I was sort of holding my tongue because I was going to mention, there are downsides to this stuff, but I didn't want to be doomy gloomy. But I think it's important to mention. But I think we also forget, because there's just this like weird time machine effect of being online all the time or often, where like 2 weeks ago feels like 5 years ago, and I think we forget like I used to follow very old tweets, which I think was a bot that somebody made, and it would be tweets from the first 90 days. And I think we forget how quickly, in the course of a decade, it went from tweets being pictures of our clever lunches and our desserts to we will dethrone the king and
and like there's very limited evidence that any of that matters or actually affected anything.
Right.
I think there was like a narrative built up around, and like, but again, like for me, like the part of the takeaway of this is that if, you know, the Twitter, literally the quote unquote Twitter that you were using in 2010 or 2011 is not the same service. It functions very differently, and it doesn't have anything to do with the number of characters there are or whatever. The context around it is really different, and the way that it functions mechanically and systemically is very different. There were deliberate changes to what ends up on your, like, because originally a service like Twitter was a whitelisting data feed thing. So you would follow people, and the only things that you would see is people you followed. And that was it. So you could, pick out programmers and artists or, musicians or writers or whatever. Like, you could make yourself an echo chamber, for better or worse.
Right.
And that would be that would be the little hang-up that you built yourself. And again, maybe that's problematic, but the internet has always been pretty good at producing echo chambers, whether people like it or not. We had plenty of live journals and MySpaces and Tumblrs before this that had all their own insular communities. I don't know that was a terrible thing in and of itself, but the sort of the big change in 2014 through 2016 was no, it is not this anymore. It is something, we've managed to come up with something even worse than an echo chamber somehow.
But was there actually a change, or was it just a change in perception, or was it also, is a component of this too, I think there were real internal and external changes. Well,
so the real external changes, obviously, are the media's view of social media, conventional media's view of social media. The idea that you could turn on a news show and they would be reporting on a tweet or something like that.
Well, that's a whole other thing.
But part of that was PR work on the part of social media platforms, trying to position themselves as these indispensable entities that are fundamental to the function of democracy worldwide or something like that, right? Which I don't think there's a ton of evidence to show that is a thing that's true about these platforms. But then internally, there were significant, dramatic changes to what information ended up in your feed and why.
So, yeah, because that's what I was going to say. I was also curious how much of this is because I have the media lens on this ostensibly, which is, it drives me up the wall, just to see how often reporting online is about the internet, and it's just embedding tweets, and it's not actually, actually digging in any deeper. While at the same time, I'm aware, we're getting older. Everyone is, but there's a newer generation coming up that, we can remember stuff. We can recognize how things are cycles, and people who are coming up, people who are new reporters on stuff aren't. And I think that there's just we talk about with the internet, context smoosh or whatever. That's a thing I haven't heard in a long time. But there's also, historical context smoosh. There's just, a total loss of, historical perspective. And so over the years, through the video game lens, I've just seen so much said, written very bluntly without often a lot of very much digging about just how insidious, poisonous, potent, powerful, quote-unquote video game culture is, without there being much clarification on, who they're referring to, what they're referring to, the fact that, one of the upsides of the internet is that you can you can cross-pollinate into different groups, and that it's not all one circus tent. And so I have just... That makes me very dizzy. It makes me very uncomfortable, and but I don't know what that's been like, as a game developer, someone whose financial stability is staked on it. Those are very scary, choppy waters to be navigating, even if it's not your customers or your community who you think is going to be affected by it, but it has to change something for you, and I'm guessing not just through social media, but maybe it is just a social media thing, and that's, that affected your Twitter experience too.
Yeah, I guess it all feels like it comes down to this thing of like knowing we have this tool that serves a bunch of needs that a bunch of people have that are very difficult to serve otherwise. There are a bunch of things that sort of like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything kind of combined do that almost nothing else does. And some of those things are good. And we don't have like a popular, valid replacement for this. Like, it used to be you could have like a RSS reader and you could syndicate content from a bunch of places that you enjoyed into like your own little mini website or whatever. Sort of internet usage and internet support for that has drifted for lots of reasons. Lots of, we want dedicated users, higher engagement kinds of things from the top down, but also from the bottom up, like, well, everybody's on here and this thing's easier to use anyway, kinds of forces. And but what you have, I think, is a situation where we have this useful tool that's like duct taped to a very, very horrible tool. But enough people still need the useful tool that it's like, what are we going to do? Like I hate what this thing is duct taped to and I hate being around it, but like, what are my options really? Or at least that's how I felt. I don't know if other people feel that way, but like, that's how I felt for a long time. And, gradually the good half of the tool, is going to offer less and less. Yeah. And your understanding of how the bad half of the tool functions, may grow a little more detail over time. And eventually I think it's kind of not really exactly like a choice that you make so much as like, this just isn't worth it. Even that notion of like, well, I don't want to browse Twitter because I don't want to be brainwashed by fake controversies or whatever, right? I'm just going to write cool bots that like post cool stuff. I'm just going to have a shit posting account. Right. But like, that's not your content on your site. Like you're still putting things into the ecosystem that you disliked enough to simply abandon. Right. Yeah. So there's a big stack of things there that I think is just, it's not like, oh, it's bad, we should stop using it. It's like, it's bad and to some degree indispensable, though maybe not in the way that the platforms position themselves to be. But so I guess like that's the stuff that I've been trying to work through personally, right? Is why is this stuff bad? Or why do I think it's bad? Why do I feel like it's bad? Not like, why are other people who use it bad or whatever? I think it's just like functionally, systemically, like what's going on here that's making me so uneasy? It's so difficult to talk about this stuff in those arenas because I found, I don't know, people get uneasy or they feel guilty or they feel somehow complicit just by logging in when you raise these kind of questions, or maybe there's something about the way it's presented. Because I quit Twitter before they doubled the length, maybe you did too, of the tweets, and so maybe there's something about just seeing two sentences together that makes it sound less like however you describe the tone of my voice and more like I'm a raging lunatic, just like furious at everything and everybody. I think that these are questions that increasingly people are having now, and I don't think there are answers. And I think it's okay to be existential on Twitter. I mean, I used to joke that like when you join Twitter, you should just get like a philosophy 101 credit because it's very easy to just throw these questions out or talk about them and actually
not get anywhere, but you sound like a philosopher. Um,
Right.
and I'm sure that applies to me too, but I don't know about the personal thing. I hear a lot of people talk about this, and I feel like I can tell who the people are who are deeply sucked into it, because I hear them speak in a way in these like great sweeping statements with single words where they say like everyone is so depersonalized, nobody cares about this issue, everyone everywhere is whatever. They talk in these extremes in a way that I don't remember really hearing when I was younger. And I don't know if that's an internet thing. I don't know if that's a helpful way of thinking about it. I don't know if that's a fixable problem, but I recognize that as a symptom of something. And I don't know if it's the echo chambers we build for ourselves or just a general feeling of helplessness that people have, or just people's desire to just sort of vent about drama. You know, it could be any of those things. It could be all of those things.
Yeah. So
but is that
thing,
an
right?
internet
so, like,
thing, though, you know?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I have a sort of ludicrous grand media theory about how some of this stuff works, which I absolutely will happily dive into in a little bit.
Is this the taxidermy thing or something else?
Yeah,
Okay.
And I think it's actually pretty valid. And for me, it's a thing of not. I guess like part of this thing is like, okay, so let's say we have these, for better or worse, indispensable tools that are complicated and likely not 100% positive. Like, if that's just like a starting point, then it's kind of like, okay, maybe it's not. Like, if you agree that going around and sort of like pointing out like this thing is bad, people shouldn't do it, or this thing is bad, people shouldn't do that. Like, because if we've already sort of agreed that like A, people don't like it when you do that, B, either they already know or they don't care, then like in general what you do and how do you talk about this stuff. And for me, it's just like this constant desire to like understand how this stuff works.
Yeah.
And not going through and scoring like the goodness and badness levels of each feature of a platform or something, although maybe there's like real interest or value in that I just don't see. But like trying to understand cognitively, emotionally, like what are these things built out of, and I guess the place where I got is this notion of, this is probably the wrong word and it's definitely a made up term, but the idea of cultural taxidermy, and the idea that there is, things feel different. There's a difference between something that's totally fabricated, and many of the parts that it's fabricated from are also fabricated, versus something that's been fabricated only from real things. And so you think about like the dawn of the 20th century, age of exploration, people traveling all over the world, killing very fancy animals, shipping them back to museums where people would taxidermy those animals and put them on display in the museum. Zoos weren't really a thing yet. It's going to be like 20, 30 years before zoos are like a legitimate human undertaking in most parts of the world. And so you have, but you don't have people just making statues of animals and putting those in the museum. You specifically have taxidermy. Like, that is the closest that you could get to the real thing in some way. So you'd have a lion, and the lion is made out of lion parts. This taxidermy lion, which is not a lion, and all the pieces of the lion come maybe from different lions, but everything there is a real lion part. And somehow that is more potent. That's like, more valuable. Like, you can literally open and operate a museum for decades on, taxidermied polar bears and whatever else, like wax statues of cavemen or something. And it's specifically seems to be that you have this sort of sculpture, and it matters that it's made out of real parts. And so if you go to something that seems totally unrelated, like conspiracy theories, like the basic function of conspiracy theory, or the basic structure of a conspiracy theory, is to have a fictional story where all the individual pieces of the story are real events, real incidents, real news clippings, right? And you take a real event that happened in a very particular historical social context, and you decontextualize it some, and you stick it onto some other decontextualized sort of, but genuinely formerly real stories. And by rearranging these things into a new shape, you get to tell a new story that is a fiction, but it's a weird kind of fiction because it's made out of nonfiction. It's like a quilt made out of like decontextualized nonfiction. And that's like a different kind of fiction in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
and it has a different appeal, I think, and it has kind of a different power.
So who does that benefit? I don't want to necessarily relegate us to the gaming space, but I think it's
I don't know.
I'm not saying there's some shadowy cabal. I'm just saying it's like, because I feel this thing often where I think I feel the ripple of that, which is like sometimes I'll be on the internet and I'll be like, they used to say you can't on the internet. No one knows you're a dog, and now it feels like I feel like, are these just two bots talking to each other, or like, is this a bot writing an article and a bot commenting on it angrily? Like,
yeah. And I don't know, like, I think part of it is not that there's, like, taxidermy by itself doesn't have an agenda. Yeah. There's just a weird power to building fake stuff out of real stuff. There's a potency to it. And you could use that potency for your colonialist museum exhibit, right? Or you can use that potency to memorialize a loved pet. Or if you're certain ancient cultures, you might use this to memorialize, great leaders or whatever, right? Like, it's just a goofy thing. And so, if you were to buy my own crackpot conspiracy theory here about how conspiracy theories are built, if you start to look at how like a lot of aspects of fandom function, fandom around video games, but also around comics and, other, formerly sort of niche nerdy interests, I think a lot of the functionality is very similar. There's like a lot of interest in, there are, fan theories and, fanships and, fan fiction and all of these things. And these are, I think, again, not as like a value judgment, not as it's tricky to start with conspiracy theories because I feel like that has connotative baggage. It has this like negative, like, oh, conspiracy theories.
Maybe we should call it like magical thinking or something.
Well, it's specifically this quilting activity, right? Yeah. Like the most powerful, the most potent stuff in fandom is not like I made up my own universe that has nothing to do with anything. It's always, I've made a new quilt out of the parts I found laying around. I decontextualize these things, I cut them out, and I put them together in a new collage, and it has a new meaning because that's how art works. That's how stories work.
Sure.
And I think there's a tremendous amount of fandom that functions in exactly that way. And that definitely affects video game stuff. But the part of the reason that I was going like, I don't feel super uncomfortable talking about this is I think that this has helped me a lot to understand social media also, is to see like, your individual social media presence is a little bit of a quilt that you make out of yourself. It's not really yourself, but you've probably mostly made it out of real parts. And maybe it closely resembles you, and maybe it doesn't. And different people have different needs for that. Maybe that's a security-driven concern. Maybe that is aspirational. Maybe it is necessary for professional reasons. There's a million reasons to have your online persona be really different from who you are in real life. And I feel like we used to have some really concrete. To me, the boundaries around those things seem to feel more real, but I think Twitter and Facebook and Instagram have this kind of thinner, blurrier line sometimes around this gap between the quilt you made out of yourself. They want you to feel like that is you and that you are it, and you're not, which is fine. And being cognizant of that is not critical necessarily. I don't think for being a healthy person or having a healthy relationship with social media or whatever. That doesn't have to have a value judgment on it either.
Yeah.
But there starts to be this wild stack, right, where individual profiles, active profiles on social media that are posting, and the profile is kind of composed of these posts. These are quilts. And then the communities that you're in online are like a quilt of quilts at that point.
Right.
And then the platform itself is a quilt of those communities. So the platform, like a social media platform, like a Twitter, is like a quilt of quilts of quilts.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that.
Right? So,
but it is.
But then, a conventional media source, like a newspaper or TV station at the airport or whatever, will come on and do a story about a tweet. Right. And it's at that point, it's this has what I'm sure some mid-century philosopher has unpacked a lot of this stuff before, but what happened in here where there are enough, there's enough layers of what degree of quilts do you need before this thing that we normally would consider laughable, like a conspiracy theory, is a news story now and considered a valid source? Is it just size and money, or is it just utility? The quilt has produced assets that are valued by the other media sources or whatever. And I don't know how to even begin trying to make a definitive statement about this is what's happening here and this is this thing and we need to stop this or whatever. It's more just wanting to be able to hold a picture of some of this stuff in my head and have a if I have to be on Twitter to promote something for our company or whatever, because that's the thing that we do sometimes, knowing that, what I'm looking at, my friends' social media accounts aren't my friends. They're my friend's quilt that they made for that site.
Right. And
that's, it's not something to be taken necessarily lightly or to be ignored or anything, but also it's important to me. It's important to constantly remind myself that is not them. And the game development community on Twitter is a quilt of quilts. It's not a group of people. And that, taking action on a social media platform, posting your petition or excoriating someone for something or, dunking on somebody or whatever. Like, all of these things are, they're not actions. They are like new quilt squares. You've added a new square to your quilt of you that isn't you, that is now kind of part of this aggregate thing owned by some kind of like robot asshole on the West Coast. And like to me, that like that's the thing. It's like, so it's like that to me, that's like a useful framework for thinking about these things, and maybe more so than like, this is bad or people shouldn't use it or whatever. It's like, my optimistic outlook is that like, if there is an ongoing, growing understanding, regardless of whether my view of it is correct, like if there's a growing sort of awareness of, what these things are, or like what is a arguably healthy way to think about these websites or platforms or services or whatever, regardless if they're Twitter or not, then maybe then it's like easier for people to make what they feel like is a more informed decision about like, is this good for me or not? Like, it feels like there needs to be like we put ingredients on food boxes for a reason, I feel like, and that's turned out fine. And I think even if people have a gut feeling about, this website's okay, or this service is probably not that good for me, but whatever, like there's a difference between like sort of thinking that that's probably true, but also being able to like look at a list of ingredients and go like, Jesus, I don't know. I think I'm done with this one. Like,
it's okay.
I think I'm.
Well, I wonder. I mean, I'm coming off of. I spent most of the from last August to this August, I was writing a book, which will be out early next year, and I managed to get a couple of OG internet people to come out of retirement to talk to me a bit, and because these are not new problems, and that was one of the other things that I was wondering about in the last couple of years is the uptick of people talking as though these kinds of problems, which again I don't really know how to categorize because they feel like the oxygen we breathe if you pay attention to this stuff, I just wanted to get a sense from them, like, are these new problems? Do you remember instances like this before, whether it has anything to do with quote-unquote fandom or not?
Right.
And even before I was working on that, like I came across, I can send it to you afterwards, there was a woman, I think, the late 80s, early 90s, who wrote like a very, I guess a manifesto, I don't know what you would call it, but she wrote about how just on message boards, like the same dynamic existing, and this was like, I guess almost 30 years ago now. Wow. Of, be mindful of what you put out on the internet. You feel a desire to be your most truthful self, but be conscious of the fact that companies own these platforms and they're mining our data.
Yeah.
And so, but I think like what there wasn't 30 years ago, because it was such a smaller pool of people online, there weren't people being like, well, just stop using the well, stop using ARPANET, stop using Plato, stop using whatever, because there were way fewer avenues of consequence. Like there wouldn't be things like swatting, or like someone would dox you, although there were instances of that. There just wouldn't be this opportunity for like some asshole on a message board. Like you'd log off, you'd eat dinner, you'd vent to your family, and the next day you'd have forgotten about it. They wouldn't be like, deploying their dark army to come after you. And so I hear a lot of people now basically say to do what we've done, which I don't really know if that's a solution. It's just a solution for us, which is like, stop using Twitter. Like they don't expect it to be fixed. They don't think these are fixable problems. But I wonder if like stated in a more proactive way is like, maybe we just need to learn to like let go of these things. And that's what I've been wondering about with like this project, the interviews I've been doing, the topics that it's on. It's like it eventually. I think that's a thing that social media can do too. Is like you just start to see everything like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything starts to look like a problem. And I do think that eclipses like I know you mentioned like there's good like. I think there's good that we're taking for granted, and I think it is a small number, like you said, it's maybe 3%. But I don't know if we know how to let go, and I don't know that we want to, and I wonder if that's like one of the sort of crux, upsetting things about this, and why it's so easy to keep talking about is because we don't know how to stop.
Yeah, so like another piece of this, right, is like these. So like one thing that's different from early internet to now, right, is you might have one privately owned website,
right,
that has a user base of maybe 1 billion people, and you have a relatively small group of programmers and editors who can decide for a group of 1 billion people, what do we want to, through the rules of how this website works, elevate to real controversies. Like, they have, there is sort of a degree of authorial control over something that I think is seen as relatively non-authorially controlled. Like there is a version of, again, like if these things are quilts, like social media is not a reflection of the real world, right? It's a quilt made out of the real world.
Right.
And somebody's in charge of what squares go where.
Well, that's a quilt made out of only the people who were there. It's not reflective of
right.
all the people
but also,
who are
like,
not there.
Even outside of the people who are there, the ideas that are there,
Exactly.
The world events that are there, all of those things, like there is a small group of people whose job is to, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, this is like a description, like a necessary description of how a platform like this functions. There's a few people whose jobs are to make the website work. And part of their responsibility, whether they acknowledge it or not, is what is allowed to go on that website and what isn't. And how are things prioritized and presented and stuff like that. And so you have that on the one hand, you have that thing, which is like, again, like it's important. I think that these websites, these platforms value this thin line. They want the quilt they make to overlay. They want you to believe that it overlays reality so closely that it's kind of hard to differentiate in a lot of ways. And that's where the value comes from in a lot of ways. That's what makes those sites, quote unquote, matter. And the quilt doesn't match, and somebody's in charge of making the quilt, but like those are things that are really, those things run counter to the goals of presenting a high fidelity reflection of the world or whatever, which it's just not there. So I think on some level there's a really fundamental problem, right? Of if you're going to present something as a high fidelity reflection of the real world, and it's not, that's not great. That makes things complicated.
Well, why do you think it has been so, this is probably not a good word for it, been so sticky that like, I mean, even the word gamers now is kind of problematic, but like, why do you think that's been so sticky that like, they're the, like people who grew up playing Super Mario Brothers are like patient zero for all the problems in our culture right now? Maybe we hear that less now, but that was certainly a wave we were riding for a while, and I still hear or read casually referenced like in books, in articles. I mean, I have my theories about it, but it still feels like, to me, like just a huge, like not all the dots were connected, but it's almost like, well, I don't know, I don't want to answer my own question.
I feel like the easy answer that I want to say is that like it's a group of people who are kind of easy marks.
Yeah.
For better or worse. It's a group of people who have a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. A group of people who, I think, are, sort of, what's the right word? I think kind of celebrated by the marketing teams who want to sell products to them. And that's really appealing if you have made part of this your core identity or whatever.
Right.
And that makes a ton of sense to me. Like, I think if the narrative about your identity, like reinforced by all the other quilts that you see online, is that like, I love video games, but most people don't. And that makes me a little bit of an outsider. That matches up with how I feel about the kinds of opportunities I've had in my life. And now this company that makes stuff that I really genuinely like and love is acknowledging this and is like reaching out to me about this. That seems like a really obviously appealing thing to experience to me, even if maybe it's not completely done in earnest. But also, like, I think a lot of these, there is it is probably slightly too easy to paint this relationship as like cold-blooded accountants manipulating nerds into buying extra action figures or something.
Right.
And like, I think it would be crazy to assume that wasn't a part of what was going on. But I think another part of what is going on is a lot of game making, even on huge teams still, is something that is, it is a creative practice. It's people who have, many people who have like overcome a lot of obstacles in order to spend an enormous amount of their time doing creative work for a living. And I think it is probably pretty natural and normal to feel a real genuine sense of like appreciation for, an audience, a massive audience of people who choose to support the work that you do, because there's no other way that you're going to do it. Like, they're, people financially supporting your creative work is how you get to do the creative work. Like, that's the culture that we live in by and large. Well, that's like a real thing. And I think that a little bit, at least a little bit of the, what I think otherwise would be really easy to classify as like pandering kinds of marketing. I think some of that stuff is pretty, comes from a pretty real place of just like, holy crap, we wanted to make this epic space adventure, and like a million people all like that idea too. Like, as somebody who makes games, I would feel like, wow, you guys are awesome. Thank you. Because like, under what circumstances would I be allowed to do this otherwise? Zero.
Well, what about the antagonism that can and does exist between, I don't know, between creators and, people who create and people who, I don't want to say consume, I don't really like that word, people who, who buy these things. Like, is that overstated? Is it understated? Like, because I've talked to so many people through the years who have stories, and you hear things, but I'm very conscious of the fact that if you spend time collecting all those stories, all you really know is those stories, but you don't know if that's a drop in the ocean or a drop in a thimble, Yeah,
it's hard for me to be able to say anything concrete about like the volume of it, aside from like, literally everyone I know who makes games has experienced this.
I've experienced it just interviewing people.
Yeah. Everyone has experienced it to varying degrees.
I mean, I experienced it before then, but I even also experienced it from creators, where I can remember a couple of years ago at a sort of an invite-only E3 party, very small gathering. Maybe it was GDC. It was GDC. Everyone who was there were friends of friends. It was a very small group, maybe 20 people, and there was one guy who was just enraged at me because I was publishing interviews with creators, and the art should speak for itself, and how dare I allow people to peek behind the curtain, and it was very surreal. There are those moments where the internet, it's like the internet has leaked into the real world here.
Yeah, or vice versa to
Sure.
some degree, right?
Sure.
But I think a piece of this is, for sure, people who make games are not somehow immune to participating in ludicrous online antagonism, right?
Sure.
Imagine my delight finding out that Ken Levine had blown up at Indie Game Maker Online, who, as part of another inside joke with a AAA game designer, had done a really funny tweet about skulls and toilets and environmental storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a AAA game designer, celebrated AAA game designer, took it upon themselves to die on that hill. And it's okay, so yeah, we're not I came up in Half-Life modding communities, right? I am so completely comfortable with and at ease with the fact that the people who play games and people who make games, that is a spectrum,
right,
of people, and not two individual groups of people, right? The biggest games on the planet are mods right now, so
that's true.
I lost my train of thought. I'm trying to go back.
That's okay. I think maybe, I don't know. I could tie it back, but I know a question I wanted to answer you is I guess the greater theme through all this is letting go and it may be enthusiasm, not necessarily dulling, but getting put into more perspective. And I think that has to do with video games itself. I guess it's just our relationship with technology. Something I was curious about is I don't know. I guess I'll just put this as a question to you. It's not really related to anything specific, but because we're talking about things getting worse and also wanting to pull away from things that are getting worse. And I guess I'm just curious, have you ever seen or heard or been a part of conversations online that are just so terrible, that are just so, poisonous, that they wind up almost self-cauterizing, and they just ends all conversation about it? Because it does seem to be a lot of the things that quote-unquote game culture is charged with is just this obsession with negativity or obsession with antagonizing. And obviously over the last couple of years we've seen a lot of really traumatic and dramatic things happen. But...
Yeah, so this is what I wanted to go back to.
Yeah.
What the thought experiment for me, right, is let's say you're an individual, craving identity, let's say.
Sure.
Like a human being, for example.
I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, and so, maybe the lowest hanging fruit for that is to sort of put yourself in one group that is to some degree defined by an opposition to another.
Sure.
The most just bare bones, basic, almost monkey culture level of things, right? Like, I'm in this guy's group now. The thing that has the thing that I think is relevant to like negativity and so on and so forth is that like the establishment of identity, that's not like a one-step process for most people. I think it's like a refinement process, right? So some people maybe try to, after laboring to establish an identity, realize that that identity is preventing them from having, a fuller life or a more healthy life or whatever. And so they start trying to like break it down. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that. But you can also do the other thing, right? Like you can say like, oh, I crave identity for confidence reasons, for tribal reasons, for social reasons. And I identify as a gamer in one form or another. As soon as you're into that subculture, there are an infinite number of subcategories that you can sort of re-identify as, right? So you say like, well, I'm not just a gamer, I'm a PC gamer, or I specifically am like an Xbox fan,
right?
Or
I play Smash and that's it, or Destiny.
Yeah, and sometimes that's just a description of your hobby,
right?
Like, and that's totally valid. But I think there's like an increasing element of like, if you're the kind of person who has a really intense and possibly not thoroughly interrogated desire to set yourself apart from other people, but also maybe you don't have the patience to do that through your own work yet, or you don't have access to do that through work, or you're not interested in doing it through work, and you simply want to do it through, say, taking action on a social media network. It seems sort of obvious and tempting to me to try to identify with a smaller and smaller sort of subgroup of gamers. So is that, the FGC? Is that some kind of conservative backlash group? Is it, all about PC modding? Is it, is your group really all about the Vita? And that's the only thing that you can tweet about is Vita-related stuff.
There are still, those people are still around.
Yeah, maybe
but it's just to openly mock what a failure the Vita was. But
yeah,
hey, that's a way you can spend your time.
Maybe you love Nintendo, and the only thing that you really do online is interact in Nintendo communities, or you're all about JRPGs or visual novels. Like you can keep paring down your identity or building it up to have like greater and greater specificity. And part of doing that often is setting yourself in opposition to other groups. And so I think it's easy to end up with this thing where, if you only had to bucket people by whether or not they love video games, you end up with this huge group of people online. That's people who make games and people who play games, and it doesn't matter what platform they play it on. But that's not really how we bucket people online.
Right.
You have like dummies who like games with bad frame rates, and you have like idiots who all they care about is frame rate, and you have like all these sort of camps that are I think important for maintaining your identity and feeling like you're doing something important for your friends and for people who are like you, so which fundamentally means people who are right. Like you wouldn't put yourself in that group if it wasn't the right group to be in. right. So, you're kind of logging on to do the right thing and dunk on some, Xbox fans or something.
Well, I don't know how you're doing.
And I think and again, not to be I personally don't see any value in dunking on anyone or anything anymore. But to me, there's this thing of wanting to know why other people log on to do that.
Yeah, I think that's
and
probably
what do they feel what drives a person to have this type of thing characterize the bulk of their online activity, above and beyond just going that sucks. I think I could write compellingly about why dunking is fucking pointless and stupid and a waste of everyone's time, not the least of which is the dunker.
Right.
But I don't know that matters so much as trying to have a sense of where does this stuff come from and kind of what keeps it alive. And so again, if you look at if you were deciding to view these platforms or services as these kind of reality adjacent quilts made out of reality parts that are kind of decontextualized and are ready to be turned into someone else's narrative.
Yeah.
And you also acknowledge this kind of deep human desire to have an identity and to be, recognized for something, or to, have a group of people who you feel like you have a lot in common with. Those are totally normal, aggressively human desires. And I think if you combine something that is, essentially a junk drawer of decontextualized real things just laying around ready to be made into a narrative, and you have literally every human on earth with this intense desire to be able to formulate a narrative in which they are simultaneously the victim and the hero, and everyone else is both their oppressor and a hopeless idiot. You have everything you need to sustain that and support that, and to exacerbate that and to amplify that. It's all just sitting there. That's just that's the only parts it's made out of. And I think these platforms have left just enough pieces in to where, if you don't want to use the platform that way, you can change your settings enough so that it kind of mostly doesn't work that way anymore. And so I think, and that provides sort of a tempting feeling of oh, well, I've unbroken it for myself, and so I can continue to participate. And
yeah,
that might be valid. I think for me it isn't, because I still see my work leaking out into this pool of materials that can be used for these quilts that I have no interest in participating.
Well, I
don't want my stuff to be, used for this.
I think for me, I don't know, because it's hard to know how much of this is just projection, because part of it is also well, why can't I just quote unquote get over it and just engage with the platform in that way and carry myself in a different way? It sounds very
well, I think that should be an option, honestly. That should be
it should.
But I think it has to come after grappling with what this thing is.
Right.
If I'm going to go back and do some more tweets, I want it to be with the certain knowledge that I am generating scraps for other people's stories, and that all of those things are owned and operated and controlled by a handful of people that I will never meet, and who I think have shown themselves to be the opposite of stewards. And just it's such an unappealing proposition for me personally.
Well, so here's a question, and I have just a couple more for you. I don't want to keep you here all day. Although I could easily talk about this for 8 hours or so. I mean, we emailed a bit about this phrase, game culture, which when I started these interviews, I think maybe I told you, like, I wasn't really sure what to think of that phrase, and then I sort of had my mind changed by a bunch of people, and then I kind of went back to skepticism or uncertainty about what it's actually referring to. But now that we're talking about all this stuff, I wonder how much of whatever that is defined by the way that these platforms work or don't work. You know what I mean?
I mean, yeah, I do. And I think it's, to me, the thing that has changed to some degree is like there's always somebody who's in charge of this to some degree, right?
Right.
Like when I was a kid, like game culture was in the United States largely determined by like Nintendo and Sega, and maybe a handful of hard to get enthusiast magazines, and really that was it. Like I think it was a really corporate first thing, yeah. But in that the corporations were the ones producing the games that you were playing. And I think, there is sort of a different there are these different arbitrary interlocutors now in the form of these sort of like nebulous social media platforms, whether it's Reddit or Twitter or whatever else, that are clearly exhibiting some force. And there's all like loads of big companies who are still doing their best to shape what these things are, because I think that's of some value to them also. So it feels like the thing that feels different to me now, though, is a lot of the platforms that are, I think, have a significant role in shaping some of these attitudes or the perceptions of the culture or whatever, have this thing of presenting themselves as grassroots when they're not, basically. And I think that like illusion of grassrootsness is a little bit different, in like the 1990s or something, there wasn't like, that wasn't really a thing. Like you could have maybe like Nintendo might put something about how much they love their fans or something. And they would publish like letters that fans, like a handful of letters that fans had written to the editor of Nintendo Power, maybe. But like, to me, that's like a very, that's a very transparent form, definition of, what aspects of the culture here are grassroots and what parts are not so grassroots. Versus now where it's like, it's not at all clear to me if a Reddit campaign to discredit a journalist or a Twitter campaign to get the ending of a game changed or whatever. I have no notion of whether or not those things are actually grassroots, above and beyond the fact that they are presented as such. Yeah. And they are presented as kind of identity opportunities for people who want to feel like they are contributing and that they are participating in this meaningful way, in a grassroots-like way. But whether or not those things are actually grassroots in like the functional sense, totally beyond me. It seems unlikely. My gut feeling is like, nah, it doesn't feel right. There's too many layers in between. There's too many kind of moderators and algorithms sort of filtering and pushing this stuff around. And, even if some of the participation is done from a grassroots point of view or with grassroots intent. I think describing the outcomes as grassroots feels like a leap to me, but I do think that there is a lot of sort of effort put forth by platforms to sort of maintain the sense or the perception or even maybe the illusion that these are simply, this is just the voice of the people. This is democracy at work.
It would probably be creepy to represent it as something closer to maybe what's actually going on. And I don't really mean that in like a conspiracy theory way, but it's like we can easily latch onto that feeling of like, oh, my voice matters and I'm part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
And unless so, this is a this is a big corporation and we just want to, we track XYZ data on you and we want to make sure you feel this way so that you post A, B, so that we get this information about you so that we can sell it to advertisers. I mean, you can read all those books if you want. It probably will make you feel less pessimistic or more. I mean, probably both, actually. But just as I think about it, like, I wonder if the other question is like, like what would have been a better rollout for the internet that we have now? Like, should it have just taken 100,000 years longer? Like, I wonder how much of this is just whiplash of just too much, too fast, and we don't know how to adapt.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's like the horrible void here. Like, I always feel like this is like there's like kind of these 3 steps to solving a problem, right? Which is like, you have to figure out what the problem is at all.
Right.
And that usually is like, you're dealing with a lot of feelings of frustration or disappointment. And then you have to try to come up with a mental model of what's going on that like logically supports those feelings if you can. If you can't, maybe that's a sign that those feelings are misplaced or whatever. And then ostensibly there's like this 3rd step. So you're like, I am acknowledging that I'm having a lot of bad feelings about this. And now I'm doing work to try to understand where those feelings are coming from. And now I am going to like formulate an alternative approach to how these things could function, or, a way to organize things such that I can create a new situation in which I like won't have those feelings anymore. And I just got nothing for that.
Yeah.
I've got nothing like, I don't know what it looks like because it feels like, there have been so many steps where things that on the face of it seem completely ludicrous to me are just actively done, and I don't know what it like. I don't see, conventional media suddenly no longer reporting on social media posts or anything. Like, I don't see these social media platforms or companies changing what they do.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of vested interest in continuing to participate and support these legacy platforms instead of participating in something new.
I mean, I think that's evidence that these things really are not grassroots, because look how little our voices actually matter to them.
Right.
Which I hope is not too cynical
about, like,
to say,
Like, if your number of, like, the percentage of your user base that is begrudgingly using it out of necessity versus, like, like the reputation your service has for, like, oh, I gotta log in now. Like, that's probably a sign that that's not like a user-driven
right.
system probably anymore. That's kind of a captured users situation, I think.
I mean, maybe this will be my last question for you, because I feel like in a weird way this is sort of closing a loop and something I was wondering about when I started doing all these interviews, which is I was wondering if all the horrible noise and all the horrible things How's that for vague? But just if part of the reason that it was so loud was because people who felt otherwise were not active on Twitter, or they were just actually playing games, or they were, not engaging with this stuff. Like, I feel like something that, like, as these kinds of questions that the stuff we've been exploring, is that's been like, as that's been a gas leak filling up the room. I guess the question is, like, what happened to, in the case of video games, like liking a thing, enjoying being around other people who like that thing, like.
Yeah,
I feel like I look at something like PAX, for example, which I know has like 2-3 things people associate with it as regressive or toxic or their controversies, but like I bet everyone who goes to PAX still has fun, and so I wonder, like, well, what are they doing right, and what is the internet doing wrong?
Yeah, and I think like there's a bunch of things. Like, yeah, I think one thing is because we still go to PAX pretty actively, and PAX mostly seems to still be like a 4-story garage sale where everybody still loves Pokemon and it's fine. Actually, I would propose that Pokemon is an intergenerational tool for peace, but that's probably a podcast for a different time. I think there's a bunch of things, right? There's community size. There's a lot of community language stuff. Ta-Nehisi Coates has talked a bunch about this stuff in ways that are like way more eloquent than I could even begin to touch on it. But there are these, language is not universal. Language within a community is closer to a dialect than it is to the exact same language spoken by another community. The things that you mean, the little references, the context, the who's in this group and who isn't kinds of things all change what you mean. And when this is like another side effect of like being in like a hyper decontextualizing, scrap drawer platform is, you have a lot of bad actors, but you also have a lot of things that their meaning has been changed. Like decontextualizing them radically changes what they mean. And the little ironic in-joke reference that you made about injustice is a thing that can get you fired suddenly, because the way that you talked about it might have been insensitive, but your intended audience was 2 people who knew where you stood and appreciated the work that you were doing, and you weren't doing anything wrong. And like that's like this is a thing. There's all these like old school like system design stuff, like mid 20th century, like up through 1970s, like information systems design thinkers, right? And they're all this stuff is about system complexity and about systems above a certain complexity. Failures are not a thing you didn't fix yet; they're inevitable. The system is too complex, and so the work that you do on systems like that becomes, okay, when things go wrong, how easy is it to fix? What can we do about it? Or, how can we separate? There's a lot of, these folks would say tightly coupled systems. Like if this part breaks, the thing attached to it breaks, the next thing breaks. You have this like domino effect, right? And so you might go through and try to like separate those systems and make them independent of each other. So if one of them breaks, it doesn't break the other 7. You only have to fix this one thing, and you try to make the feedback around that one thing better. And it turns out this is, partly to tie it back to game design. Like in games, this is usually bad. You want all your systems to be tightly coupled. This is why like games have them like all the most notorious software bugs and the craziest patch notes, is because tightly coupled systems with crazy domino effects are one of the things that make games fun and surprising and interesting and cool. Like catastrophes in a safe make-believe space are great. You want that. Want that. Like, that's a desirable quality.
They're kind of Gordian knots to detangle, though.
Yeah, like that's what you want, but
or a quilt of a quilt of a quilt, if you will.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, like, if you're trying to, like, video games often, within the game at least, it's not trying to convince you that this is reality. It's trying to convince you that this is an escape. This is escapist, and this is a fantasy, and so this catastrophe is fun. And I think social media platforms are designed to function a lot like MMOs. And but when they break, it's like it's feeding back. Like, if the game that you're playing is like, it's real life, the game, and everything in here is real, and all the things in here are based on your friends' personal lives. And then, like, when there are glitches in that, when a group of players finds an exploit in that, it's really functionally different than, like, a Quest and WoW breaking. Even if systemically it's the same thing, like, the context in which it's happening is so radically different. And so, like, and I feel like social networks really feed off of this. Like, there's kind of nothing better for a social network than for one of their users to have their life ruined by the network itself, because it becomes a point, another point in the, wow, we really matter in the wider world, we're really making an impact category. It's a point in the, oh, wow, look at this drama. People are going to really want to follow this, and that's really going to kick up engagement. And I think if you have constructed a system in which the destruction of some of your users for the entertainment of your other users is kind of like a thing that is a net win for your platform, then you have kind of a really basic kind of incentives and exploits problem. Like, there's a reason that, online hate campaigns or whatever are almost never moderated by the platforms upon which the campaigns are exercised. It's because they're good for the platform. They're not bad for the platform.
Yeah.
They do everything that the platform is built to do.
I mean, I remember before we started, I was mentioning Reddit, and I remember 2014, 2015, when Reddit was going through whatever its controversies were. I remember the founder, basically all he posted was, I'm just going to sit and eat some popcorn.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's really interesting and insightful for a website that, like, its slogan is the front page for the internet.
Right.
And I'm like, wow. I think I was still on social media at that point. Like, I think that was a very accelerated thing from those few years. I think I felt like I was still on social media at that point more out of, like, I wanted, like, like when you're a kid and you have to dissect the frog, which I don't know if they make kids do that anymore. It's more like, I just want to, like, poke at this thing. I don't really know that I learned anything, but I sure learned it was gross.
Right. Yeah.
And that wasn't that long ago. That was like 2-3 years ago, But it feels like 30 years ago.
And I think it's got to be, like, the thing for me, like, especially where this overlaps games, is, like, you hear about, you want to read about a EVE Online, heist, right? You want to read about, these 12 capital ships, like, teleported into a Nazi system and blew everybody up and stole all their money. And, they did it using a calendar exploit, and now they have to convene a special Senate thing within the unit. Like, I want to read that. That is legitimate entertainment. And a big part of that is, like, maybe it's tethered to the real world. Like, maybe, like, occasionally, like, an EVE raid involves somebody with bolt cutters cutting power to an apartment complex or whatever, right? But there's still a line in the sand somewhere. There's still a visible line between EVE Online and, your day job. And, like, I feel like that's the line that a lot of these platforms are crossing, but they still have all of these big MMO raid mechanics built into their design. And And in a way, like there's a very cyberpunk part of me that's like, hell yeah, this is dope. And then there's like the rest of me who's a person who's like, this is where a lot of my like fear and a lot of my, hesitation and a lot of my like flight reaction is coming from is this thing. Like it's an MMO and everybody is sort of pretending that it's not.
I mean, I read something earlier this week. I don't know how cynical this will sound to you. They were talking about activism as if it was activism online is an MMOG was the phrase that I read. And I remember 5-6 years ago, it used to feel like, click to protest, like on Twitter. I think it was before some of the things you were talking about. But like, I just wonder, like, as we say all this, and I don't know if you mentor anyone or if you are in contact with, people who are 20 years younger than us. Like, I just wonder, like, do we just sound like a couple of curmudgeons, or like what are we talking about? Like, do you find that younger people, are they conscious of this stuff too? Are they worried too, or is this just the new normal and we have to get out of the way? They're just waiting for us to step out of the way.
I have no idea. Like, I don't know if we're like the uncanny valley problem where like people older than us maybe don't view social networks this way at all, and we were just there. And people younger than us don't view social networks this way at all, but in a good way.
Right.
That maybe they understand more about how they work because they started using them after they were kind of like fully metastasized in a way.
Right.
And so we have this awkward, like, I know that part of my problem is I was using Twitter when it was a good money-losing service, and I liked it. I felt like, it was part of my identity to some degree. And then when Twitter kind of rebranded itself as a kind of like force for world democracy or whatever in like 2014-ish, I can remember feeling like, or 2013 or whatever it was, like, oh, yeah, like this makes sense because I use this website and I like this website and I think it's good, and it's crazy that it's, it's so good that it changed a corrupt political system somewhere.
Right.
Amazing. That's great. And then, having to come to terms after the fact that, oh, that's not what they got me.
Yeah. They
just hella got me, and I'm a big dummy, and like, oh, that's on me. Like it was a line and I bought it. And maybe if you started using the service in 2012 or 2013 or something, or any of these platforms that maybe you're already using these services without having had that sort of brief honeymoon feeling of like, oh wow, computers, I really can change the world just by sitting here and looking at dick jokes.
Or drill.
Like finally, like I can stop marching. Great. Like if you never got sold that and never bought it, then maybe it's nothing. And the Twitter that we see, like I imagine, the peak of World of Warcraft, there was probably loads of group chat, protest and activist tweets in town centers all over World of Warcraft, right? Because that's what people do when you're online. You shout about your identity and the things that you want to see changed. But nobody was, no reporters or conventional media were on those World of Warcraft servers taking notes on what everybody was saying, and there was no way to go browse that stuff after the fact. It was, ephemeral to some degree.
There are some books written that I could that I came across to get ready to write my book that I could tell you about. I mean, there's stuff like that documenting things all the way back to to Second Life. But I think one other
Yeah.
sea change that I think is the linchpin in all this is not only did people think of the internet as a utopia or think of these platforms as things that were somehow resistant to society, but people used to talk about, like, one of the appealing things about the internet was that you could forge some sort of new identity, that, like, you were not the person that you were IRL. You know, you were not even your gender. You were some sort of, I mean, it almost sounded like people were talking about, like, you could be your soul in some way, or you could build a new one. And as time has gone on, like, we've chiseled away at it to, again, since a lot of this is about Twitter, like, just look at, like, the conventions of a Twitter bio. You know, like, we have gone so much from, like, we can be this, like, ethereal spiritual presence to
Right.
Here I am in 6 words, and this is exactly who I am. And also, by the way, I'm verified.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and again, like, and no, like we were talking about earlier, like, I think there is real value in, you know, changing who you are online for aspirational reasons, for personal reasons, for security reasons, for all of these things. But it's this presentation of there is no line, even though for every user there is a line. And I think over time that has the potential to, I think it gets harder and harder to see the line. Like, there's somebody who just there's a line on the ground, and there's a bunch of people working really hard to cover it up, and you know it's there, but you keep not seeing it for months and months and months and years and years and years, and eventually, like, it gets hard to remember where the line is. It gets hard to remember that your identity on these sites is something you made up. It's like, it's exactly, you know, like, I wouldn't say it's exactly right, because it's made out of real things. Like, it's so different than, like, if my Twitter profile was like my Sonic OC from when I was in middle school, like, the line would be so clear to me, and the power would be a lot less, because this narrative isn't made out of all of my real life, a bunch of real life pieces that I've curated and kind of rearranged. And I think these sites, because so many profiles are aspirational, and because so many profiles are people trying to show their best selves, I think there's a lot of incentive for these services and platforms to encourage you to think of your aspirational profile as something that you are already also.
Right.
I don't know.
And I don't think this has to do per se with, like, quote unquote video games or any individual subculture.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something much deeper, much more basic, which is, I don't want to say it's like we don't like who we are, but that's part of being aspirational, is we wish we could change it. And I don't think it's as simple as signing up for an account online. Although that does seem to be the reality we're wading through, is a lot of dissonance from people.
Like, you open this thing up and you see your profile, and you see all the things that you've picked out that are kind of your best things about yourself, and you've put them up here, and you're presenting them, and that helps you feel like, you know, you're maybe not just making progress toward, you know, being more like that more of the time, but that you're also, that's kind of like, especially while you're on this service and engaging with the service, that this is kind of who you are. And like, again, like, I don't think that in and of itself is bad or anything like that. But it seems like something that, it seems like there's a lot of pressure or incentive for the services to, like, mask this a little bit, or to have it be less conscious. I don't know.
I just feel like when we're on our deathbeds that none of us are going to say, gee, I wish I tweeted more. That's just my hunch.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree.
Okay. How's that for a positive note to end on? Happy Thanksgiving.
I mean, that's probably true of other things. Like when I'm dying, I'm not going to say, I wish I raked more leaves.
Yeah.
But, woof, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Adam. Well, it's good to talk to you again. You want to do it again in another 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I like that plan.
Okay. I'll go ahead and hit stop.